He thought he was buying solitude, a plot of land nobody wanted, 3 days from the nearest gas station, surrounded by hills that hadn't heard a human voice in decades. But the moment he stepped onto the porch and saw 3 figures towering in the shadows of the barn 9 feet tall, barefoot, and watching him like a last meal, he knew something was wrong, especially when the tallest one smiled with too many teeth and said, "We've been waiting for you, little man. Before we dive in, let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories that start off strange and only get stranger stories where the line between prey and partner is razor thin, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's tale, it's even wilder than this one." They told him it was cursed, not with ghosts or folklore, but with something stranger, the kind of stories you hear in whispers at truck stops between cigarettes and coffee. No livestock ever stayed alive more than a few months. Crops grew, then rotted from the inside out. And the last 3 owners? Gone. Not legally missing, not in the system, just gone. Still, Carson Hale didn't care. He'd bought the place for pennies on the dollar, scraping together what was left of his construction injury settlement to finally own something, anything that was his. He figured the land just needed someone who didn't scare easy, someone who didn't believe in fairy tales. He figured wrong. The first thing he noticed when he arrived wasn't the isolation, that part he liked. It was the way the trees bent toward the house, not away from it, like they were leaning in to watch. The air felt too still, like the land was holding its breath. He parked his truck and stepped out, boots crunching over dead grass that felt almost spongy underfoot. The main house was old but sturdy, a classic Western 2-story with a deep wraparound porch and a rusted weather vane that hadn't spun in years. But it was the barn that pulled his attention. The doors were slightly ajar, and inside, something moved slow, heavy, deliberate. Carson squinted. Probably an elk, maybe a vagrant. He wasn't the type to scare. Still, he grabbed the crowbar from the bed of his truck and approached with caution. The barn smelled like cedar and soil and something else, something sweet and rotting, like fruit left too long on the branch. He nudged the door open farther, and that's when he saw them. 3 women. Or something like women. One was brushing her long, platinum hair with a rake. Another leaned against a beam, arms like tree trunks crossed over her chest. The third crouched barefoot in the straw, chewing what looked like jerky but wasn't. They were enormous. Each at least 9 feet tall, but perfectly proportioned, their limbs powerful but fluid, their bodies imposing yet somehow elegant. When they turned to look at him, it felt like gravity shifted in the barn. "New owner?" the one with the rake asked. Her voice was deep but melodic, echoing slightly like it didn't come from her mouth, but from somewhere behind his eyes. Carson gripped the crowbar tighter. "I think so. This is 14 Arrow Ridge Lane, right?" The one chewing nodded slowly. "We know what you think, but what's written on paper doesn't always match what was promised in flesh." That sentence shouldn't have made sense, but something primal in Carson understood it. His instinct screamed for him to back away, get in the truck, leave everything behind. But then the tallest one stepped forward, her bare feet silent against the hay, and bent low so her face was level with his. "You're just the right size," she whispered. Carson didn't remember dropping the crowbar, but it lay at his feet like a discarded illusion of control. The tall one's breath was warm and sweet with something fermented, her eyes pale gray like polished stone. She studied him the way a sommelier inspects a bottle, gently, curiously, but with the knowledge she could uncork him at any time. Behind her, the one chewing let out a short laugh that rippled through the barn rafters like a tremor. "He doesn't believe it yet," she said, ripping off another bite of the dark meat. "They never do." Carson tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his tongue felt thick. "I bought this place fair, from a guy named Randall Monroe. He said it was abandoned." "Randall didn't abandon it," said the second one, the one with the arms like timber beams. "He was digested." The words didn't register at first, not until she reached into a burlap sack behind her and pulled out a stained leather belt, worn, cracked, and unmistakably human-sized. His stomach twisted. "That's not funny. We're not trying to be," the tall one replied, still crouched at his eye level. She had freckles like soft rust across her nose and collarbone. "We don't eat everyone. Just the ones who come here with no respect. The ones who think ownership is the same thing as belonging." "Then, I didn't know." Carson's voice was barely audible. "I didn't mean to take anything from anyone." She tilted her head. "And yet you came with tools, with expectations, with your name already carved on a mailbox out front." He felt suddenly naked, like everything he thought about himself, his independence, his courage, was being weighed and found wanting. "So what do you want from me?" The one who'd been chewing finally stood, Her legs were long and scarred, not in a grotesque way, but like a warrior's stories etched into skin. "We don't want your fear," she said, "or your apologies. Just your truth." "My truth?" The second one walked closer now, her presence like a moving wall of heat. "Tell us why you came, the real reason, not the one you rehearsed at the title office." Carson hesitated. He could lie. Say he came for the quiet, the land, the opportunity. But in their presence, lies felt pointless. "I wanted to disappear," he admitted. "My brother took everything in the will. My girlfriend left the next week. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to be somewhere no one could look at me like I was broken." For the first time, none of them moved. No threats, no riddles, just silence. "You're not broken," said the tall one finally. "You're just small. That's why we haven't eaten you." Carson blinked. "What does that mean?" The one with the scarred leg stepped forward, her voice softer now. "It means there's still a place for you here, but not as an owner, not as a man in charge." She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "You're going to have to learn how to be devoured, slowly." Oh, Carson didn't sleep that night. He sat in the creaking kitchen chair of the ranch house, staring out through dusty windows toward the barn, where the shadows had long since swallowed the three towering women. The air smelled like old pine and mouse droppings, but it was the silence that got to him. No coyotes, no wind. Even the crickets seemed to have the sense to keep quiet. He ran his hands over the tabletop, rough with years of wear, and tried to ground himself in something real, something human. But even the table felt too large, wider, longer than standard, like it had been custom built for someone who didn't need to stoop to walk through doorways. At dawn, he stepped outside, hoping that maybe the rising sun would make it all make sense. But the barn was still there. So was the silence. And when he wandered to the back of the property line, past the chicken coop that hadn't held a single feather in years, past the rusted tractor stripped for parts, he saw it. A plank nailed to a dead tree, weather-warped and barely clinging to the trunk. He had to step close to make out the writing, carved with what looked like a hunting knife. The grooves were deep, angry. A warning. If you're a big man, run. If you're a small man, kneel. His breath caught. It hadn't been signed. But below the message, something had been scratched violently into the bark, a drawing, crude but unmistakable. Three figures towering over a fourth, smaller one, arms outstretched, smiling, or maybe snarling. It was hard to tell. He walked back slowly, boots dragging. He had questions, of course. What did small mean to them? Size? Heart? Power? And why did the message sound like it was meant for him specifically? He hadn't told anyone he was coming here, hadn't even told his mother. Just packed the truck and left. And yet, they knew. The women knew his name, knew his story, knew what he needed before he even said it. Back inside the house, he wandered the halls, letting his fingers trail along the walls. The whole place was too tall, doorknobs placed too high, mirrors hung for someone whose eyes sat at a different level. He found himself in the upstairs bedroom, the one he assumed had belonged to the previous owner, Randall, or what was left of him. The bed frame was steel, bent in places like something large had dropped onto it. A notebook sat on the windowsill, weather-stained and swollen with moisture. He flipped it open with hesitation. Page after page was filled with a single sentence repeated in different handwriting, as if written under duress or madness. "They don't eat flesh. They eat who you used to be." Carson closed the book. Behind him, the floor creaked. He turned. They were inside. Helena, he'd overheard the name last night, ducked beneath the doorframe and looked at him with something unreadable. Not hunger, not kindness, something in between. "Did you find the warning?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Then you know," she said, stepping into the room, her presence eclipsing the light behind her. "What we eat can only be given, never taken." He should have run. Every instinct Carson had left was screaming at him to go. But when Helena filled the doorway, tall, calm, barefoot, he didn't feel trapped. He felt chosen. Like this had been in motion long before he ever signed a deed or packed his bags. She walked past him without a word and sat on the edge of the bed. The steel frame groaned under her weight, but didn't break. "Do you know what we mean by eating?" she asked, her voice so soft it almost dissolved into the morning dust hanging in the air. "I don't think I do," Carson said honestly. She nodded, then reached into the pocket of her linen dress and pulled out a small wooden token. It was about the size of a silver dollar, engraved with swirling lines and symbols he didn't recognize. "This is your first offering," she said, setting it beside him. It means you're willing to be seen, to be made small in front of something larger. Carson picked it up. The wood was warm, too warm for morning air. Is this a ritual? No, she said. It's a choice. Ruth entered next. She was the one with the scarred legs and the eyes that always seemed to be searching the horizon. She didn't speak, just walked to the corner of the room and leaned against the wall like she'd been there 100 times. Her presence wasn't threatening. It was grounding. The third woman, Mara, the one who had laughed with her mouth full and eyes hollow, followed moments later. She carried a folded piece of paper and laid it flat on the desk by the window. It's not a contract, she said without looking at him. It's a request. Carson stepped toward it. The paper was handwritten, but neatly. Precise curves, no flourishes, no deception. It wasn't legalese. It wasn't some ancient code. It was just a list of things they needed from him if he chose to stay. Let go of the story where you are owed anything. Accept that strength is not your currency here. Submit not out of fear, but out of respect. Speak only when your words grow something. Offer your body only when you can hold your soul inside it. Become food only when you hunger to be consumed. He read it twice, then a third time. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a mirror, something he'd never been brave enough to ask of himself. Slowly, without fully understanding why, he nodded. Helena stood. Good, she said. Now kneel. Carson hesitated, then sank to his knees. Not because she ordered it, but because the act of lowering himself felt like the first honest thing he'd done in months. Ruth stepped forward and rested her massive hand on his shoulder. It was calloused and heavy, but not cruel. You've passed the first hunger, she whispered. Now we feed you before we take you. They led him to the dining room, which he hadn't dared enter until now. The ceiling soared too high, and the table was carved from a single slab of dark wood that must have weighed a ton. It stretched nearly the length of the room. 3 chairs, enormous, throne-like, stood at one side. Across from them was a single stool, barely more than a plank with legs. Helena gestured for him to sit. We don't dine across from each other, she said. Not here. We dine side by side or not at all. He took the stool. It creaked beneath him, but held. The 3 women took their seats slowly, deliberately, the sound of wood scraping against the stone floor like thunder. Then Ruth began to serve. Not with plates, but with her hands. Bowls of thick stew, a tray of roasted vegetables, charred meat he couldn't identify, but that smelled rich and savory. She ladled everything into a wide wooden bowl and set it in front of him. You eat first, Mara said, so we know you're still your own. Carson looked down at the food. It was hot, freshly cooked. Even though he hadn't seen a fire or smelled smoke, his stomach growled. He hadn't realized how hungry he was, not just for food, but for something that felt like care, like nourishment. He took a slow bite of the stew. It was spiced with something earthy and foreign, and it warmed him instantly. The meat was tender. The broth was thick. Every flavor felt intentional, ancient, familiar in a way that made his bones ache. Ruth nodded, satisfied. Now we eat. The 3 women reached into separate bowls placed at the far end of the table, their hands graceful but animalistic. There were no forks, no knives. They tore bread with calloused fingers and dipped it into the same stew. But they didn't eat like brutes. They chewed slowly, silently, with reverence. Carson couldn't stop watching them. He felt like a child at a family reunion he didn't remember being part of. Every motion they made looked like a ritual, but they treated it like routine. At some point, Mara leaned close and whispered, Hunger is more than stomach. It's shape, it's posture, it's how you show up. Carson looked down. He'd been slouching without realizing it. He straightened. That's better, Helena said, her voice warm. You're learning to carry your smallness with pride. The comment should have insulted him, but it didn't. In their presence, small didn't mean weak. It meant adaptable, precious, rare. As the meal ended, the air grew heavier, not with tension, but with anticipation. The 3 of them looked at him not like a man who'd passed some test, but like a resource they were beginning to believe in. Ruth wiped her mouth and leaned forward. Next comes your true hunger, she said. The one you've ignored your whole life. And what's that? Carson asked, his voice steady for the first time. Helena smiled. To be needed. That night, the rain came in sheets. Thunder rolled over the hills like hooves in the sky, and Carson stood barefoot on the porch, watching the storm unravel above the barn. He didn't know if he was still afraid. That feeling had begun to dissolve, replaced by something more complicated, awe, maybe, or surrender. Behind him, the door creaked open and Helena stepped out, barefoot, wearing nothing but a cotton shift soaked through by the downpour. Her hair clung to her neck like ivy. She didn't say a word, just stood beside him, her shoulders squared, eyes on the same horizon. "Storms never came like this back home," Carson said. Helena blinked slowly. "You're not home anymore." He nodded. "I know." For a while they just listened. The roof groaned. Rain rattled the tin gutters. The land smelled like iron and soil. And then, without warning, Helena exhaled a sharp, broken sound, half cough, half sob, and covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders trembled. Once. Then twice. Carson had never seen anything look so fragile and so colossal at the same time. He turned toward her, unsure if touching her was allowed, but she reached for him first. One large, calloused hand gripped the side of his neck, holding him like he might vanish. She fell to her knees, bringing them eye to eye, and let the tears fall without shame. "I'm so tired of pretending we don't feel anything," she said, the words spilling out between sobs. "Every man who's come here, every deal we've made, every game we've played, it's always power, always dominance. But you," she didn't finish. Instead, she buried her face against his chest, and he let her. His arms wrapped around her out of instinct, not bravado. She didn't need protection, she could crush him with a flick of her wrist, but she needed something else. A softness the world never allowed her. A witness. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered. "You're doing everything right," she whispered back. The rain fell harder. Lightning lit the trees like bones in the night. Mara and Ruth watched from the window, silhouettes behind the fogged glass. But they didn't interrupt. Whatever was happening on the porch wasn't for them. It was Helena's moment, the tallest, strongest, most guarded among them, finally letting herself crack. Carson pulled her closer, feeling the way her body shook beneath his hands. It wasn't weakness. It was weight being finally put down. Years of holding things together. Years of keeping the others safe. And now, she was letting someone hold her, someone small. Yes, but someone willing. Eventually, she pulled away and looked at him with eyes swollen from crying but shining with something else. "Trust. We've needed this," she said. "Not just me. All of us. Not to eat, but to feel full again." Carson nodded slowly. "So what happens now?" She rose to her full height, wiped her face, and smiled, a real one. "Now," she said, "we see if you're strong enough to stay soft." The kitchen was warmer than it had any right to be, lit only by the glow of an iron stove and the soft flicker of lanterns that hung from ceiling beams made to support more weight than any normal home would need. Carson stood at the counter, or what passed for a counter, more of a butcher's block the length of a canoe. He chopped root vegetables with a blade nearly the size of a machete. The women had watched him try to use the standard knives earlier and gently laughed when they barely fit in his hand. So they gave him their tools, oversized, worn from decades of use, and somehow it felt right. He wasn't trying to make himself bigger anymore. He was learning to use what wasn't built for him. Ruth stood nearby, mixing something thick and red in a wooden bowl that looked like it had been carved from the trunk of a tree. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her scars catching the light like stories. "We usually don't let outsiders cook," she said without looking up. "Not because they're bad at it, because they don't stay long enough to understand what the food's for." Carson paused his chopping. "Isn't it just food?" She gave him a long look. "Nothing's just food here." Mara entered from the hall, carrying a bundle of herbs that looked like they'd been pulled from some prehistoric garden. She handed them to Carson. "Crush these, but gently. Not to kill them, just to release their memory." He didn't ask what that meant. He didn't have to. He pressed the leaves between his fingers and inhaled. They smelled like salt, cedar, and something else, something older than scent, almost like a memory of his grandmother's porch after it rained. He blinked and ground the herbs into a ceramic bowl, careful not to pulverize. "Just open." Ruth tasted the stew, nodded once, and handed him a wooden ladle as long as his forearm. "Go ahead," she said. Carson took a sip and was surprised by the emotion that rose in his throat. It wasn't just the richness of the flavor, it was the fact that he'd made this, with them, using their ingredients, their tools, their rules. It tasted like being allowed. "You're starting to belong," Mara said gently. "That's the real hunger. Not to be filled, but to be used, needed, trusted." He didn't respond, just stirred the pot slowly, letting the rhythm of the motion settle his nerves. Helena appeared in the doorway, changed into a long linen robe, her hair damp from the storm. She watched them for a moment, her gaze soft but unreadable. We eat in 10, she said. Then her eyes landed on Carson. You're cooking tomorrow. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It was a sign. And for the first time in a long, long while, Carson smiled without flinching. The attic smelled like ash and secrets. Carson hadn't planned to explore it, but Ruth had mentioned, offhandedly, that every man before him had eventually gone looking for it. That alone made it feel like a challenge. The trapdoor was hidden behind a sliding panel in the upstairs hallway, nearly 9 feet high, too tall for him to reach without standing on a chair. He climbed carefully, the wooden ladder creaking beneath his weight. At the top, dust floated like snowflakes in the beam of his lantern. The room was cramped, but clearly not built for people his size. Everything, the shelves, the benches, the journal resting on a table carved from a single slab of petrified wood, was scaled to someone massive. He found the journal first. Leather-bound, heavy. Its cover bore no name, but the first page made it obvious who it had belonged to. I promised them I'd stay. The handwriting was messy, slanted hard to the left. Randall Monroe, the man who had sold him the land for a fraction of its worth. Carson flipped to the next page. I thought I could handle it. The power, the praise, the attention. But it's not about that. They don't want worship. They want witness. They want presence. And I couldn't give them that. Each page after that was a slow unraveling. Randall had arrived much like Carson had broken, adrift, desperate for a fresh start. And the women had offered him one, but he'd treated it like a conquest, like the land owed him something. He'd taken their strength as permission, used their hunger to feed his own ego. Asterisk, asterisk. I kept thinking I could rewrite the rules. He had scrawled halfway through the journal, that I could love them on my terms. But they don't bend. They don't shrink for you. You either become small willingly, or you get broken trying to stay big. Carson's fingers tightened around the pages. The tone shifted by the final entries, less arrogant, more frantic. I told them I was leaving. Helena didn't stop me. Ruth didn't say a word. But Mara cried. He could almost hear her voice. The gravel of it, the laughter that always carried something sharp. He wondered what it had looked like when a woman 9 feet tall shed tears for a man too selfish to see what he had. The last page was the shortest. I'm not writing this because I think anyone will find it. I'm writing it because they deserve better than me. If someone does read this, don't promise them anything. Just be with them. That's what I couldn't do, and what they've waited so long for. Carson closed the book gently. The attic didn't feel haunted. It felt disappointed. He ran a hand along the shelf. Every object here had weight, memory, devotion. Back downstairs, the women sat quietly at the table, as if they knew exactly what he'd read. Mara looked up at him. So? She asked softly. Did you learn what not to be? Carson nodded once, slow and sure. Yeah, he said. And I won't promise you anything. Helena smiled faintly. Good. Now you're ready. The barn looked different now. It wasn't the light, though. The afternoon sun had started to pour through its slats in soft golden beams. And it wasn't the scent, which still held that strange mixture of hay, cedar, and something deeper. No, it was Carson. He wasn't entering with fear anymore, or resistance. He walked in barefoot, the way they had taught him, grounding each step into the wood like it meant something. Ruth stood inside near the far wall, hanging lengths of dried herbs on a thick beam. She didn't turn to him, just nodded once. Take your shirt off, she said gently. You shouldn't carry the past into the next thing. Carson didn't ask why. He peeled off the fabric, folded it, and placed it on a stool. The air kissed his skin with a quiet chill. He felt small, but not weak. He had come to understand that smallness wasn't a flaw here, it was a sacred geometry. He was part of a larger pattern, not a conqueror. A vessel. Mara appeared next, carrying a basin of warm water and a cloth. She knelt before him without a word, dipped the cloth, and began to clean the dust and sweat from his hands. Her touch was firm but slow, ritualistic. As she worked, she said, most of them never made it to this part. They got scared when they realized the hunger was never really about flesh. What is it about? Carson asked. She looked up at him with eyes that were suddenly too soft for this world. Witness, integration, becoming part of something without needing to own it. Helena entered last, towering over them both, her robe fluttering slightly in the wind that had slipped through a cracked plank. She walked to him and studied his face with a long, quiet reverence. We've devoured men before, she said, but not the way they imagined. Not with teeth, with knowing, with need. They don't understand that being consumed can be sacred. Carson swallowed, heart pounding. And me? You? Helena reached out and touched his chest, her palm warm and steady. You're not for eating. You're for something else. Mara rose and stood behind him. Ruth joined at his side. Together, they formed a circle around him, three forces of nature, eyes calm, hands waiting. What do you want from me? He asked. Ruth answered, her voice low and slow like an oath. We want your smallness, your silence, your truth, not as an offering, as a foundation. Mara continued, we'll build on you, not over you. And Helena finished, you won't be swallowed. You'll be worn like skin, like song. Carson felt tears rising, uninvited. And if I mess it up, you will, said Helena. And we will too. But we don't leave, added Mara. And we don't abandon, Ruth said. The sun dipped lower. The barn glowed like a cathedral. Carson took one final breath of the world he came from, then let it go. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a rhythm, a pulse, a shared breath that moved through the floorboards and the walls and the spaces in between. Carson had started to forget what day it was, not out of confusion, but because time here flowed differently. There were no appointments, no clocks ticking towards something urgent. Only cycles, meals cooked together, fences repaired with quiet hands, storms weathered side by side in candlelit rooms. He wasn't the man who arrived with a deed anymore. That man had been too big in all the wrong ways, puffed up with loneliness, expectation, and the noise of a world that mistook dominance for survival. Now he moved through the space like water, light on his feet, listening more than he spoke. His bed, once stiff and cold, had been replaced with a hand-woven mat on the floor near the hearth, where the heat pooled and the shadows told their stories. Helena had built him a chair low to the ground, perfectly carved for his frame, and when he first sat in it, she'd said, "Now you fit." He hadn't known how badly he'd needed to hear that. There were still moments of discomfort, nights when he felt the old weight creep back in the voice that told him he had to lead, fix, prove. But each time it surfaced, one of them would sense it. Mara would hum from across the room, grounding him with a sound that vibrated deeper than bone. Ruth would pass him a bowl and simply say, "Stir this until your hands stop shaking." Helena would kneel beside him and ask, "What are you carrying that you forgot to set down?" He had never known intimacy could feel like peace instead of pressure. One afternoon, as they walked the edge of the property past the oak trees bent in eternal hush, Helena pointed to a weathered post with his name carved into it. It had been there since he arrived, a silent symbol of ownership. Without a word, she handed him a chisel. Carson stared at it, then looked back at her. "You're not erasing yourself," she said gently. "You're just letting go of the lie that this place ever belonged to anyone." He stepped forward and carved a new word beneath his name. Part of. The women smiled, and no one spoke. Nothing more needed to be said. That night, as they sat around the hearth, Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. Ruth's hand rested on his knee, warm and steady. Helena, ever the sentinel, dozed with her arms crossed but her heart open. The fire crackled low, and outside, coyotes howled not as a threat, but as a hymn to the desert. Carson closed his eyes. He had been promised many things in life: love, success, independence. But no one had ever promised him this, the right to be small and still be held. And so he stayed, not to be devoured, but to be known.